Anybody who's ever heard of Vladimir Putin is likely to know at least two things about Russia's leader. He invaded Ukraine, and he presents himself as a real macho man. For years, ridiculously staged photo ops brought us images of a bare-chested Putin riding horseback, relaxing on fishing trips, swimming the butterfly stroke, or just strolling along the riverside. Now that Putin is 70 years old, we're understandably getting less of his torso. But the Kremlin nevertheless relies on tropes of masculinity to validate the regime and its actions abroad, particularly in Ukraine, and when it comes to confrontation with the West. This gendered rhetoric resonates with Russians just as it does in societies and nations all over the world. The authorities and the public work together to manufacture consensus about who gets to be on top, who and what constitute threats, and what actions are legitimate. When it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, for example, the promotion and the draw of various anti-feminism and anti-gay narratives in Russia have facilitated the idea itself that an independent, Western-leaning Ukraine poses an existential threat. This language has helped make plausible for Russians a war that was inconceivable until only recently. So what happens if you take away that rhetoric? Without the influence of gendered language on Russia's securitization process, what's left of Moscow's justifications for the war? Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the Naked Pravda. I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa's English language edition. On today's show, we're speaking to the author of a new academic article about how feminization rhetoric helps legitimize Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Before jumping into today's interviews, allow me to remind listeners that Medusa now relies on contributions from people like you in our international audience to sustain our everyday operations. Millions in Russia and other countries read our news coverage. Even though they're now based abroad, our journalists obtain exclusive information about what goes on behind the closed doors of the Russian authorities. Our team delivers Medusa's most important stories in English, and we reach thousands of journalists and professionals all over the world with our special English language newsletter and podcast. So please visit our website to make a one-time or recurring donation and tell your friends and colleagues about our fundraising if you can. Okay, let's get to today's show. Dr. Lisa Goffman is an assistant professor of Russian discourse and politics at the University of Groningen and the author of two books, 2017's Security Threats and Public Perception, Digital Russia and the Ukraine Crisis, and the forthcoming book, Everyday Foreign Policy, Performing and Consuming the Russian Nation After Crimea. Earlier this week, very recently, just a few days ago, the academic journal Media, War, and Conflict published Dr. Goffman's latest article titled Damsels in Distress, Fragile Masculinity in Digital War. The rest of this podcast episode, the rest of today's Naked Pravda show, is our conversation about this article. But I will first read the abstract to give readers some context. Now, if this feels a bit dense or too scholarly at first, please hang in there. I'm not a professor, so I did my best to drag Lisa down to my level, to our level. Okay, here's the abstract. The Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, was a culmination of anti-Ukrainian rhetoric that Russian political elite and state-controlled media have been promoting at least since 2013. Apart from accusing Ukraine of being a neo-Nazi state, pro-Kremlin commentators have espoused a heavily gendered rhetoric describing Ukraine as a loose woman in need of saving by its older brother. Gendered discourse was instrumental in Russian foreign policy not only through aggressive masculinity, but also through femininity. The latter, in contrast, sought to downplay the aggressive masculinity associated with fascism and consequently diminish Ukraine's agency and status compared to Russia. This article offers a taxonomy of feminization rhetoric that shows how different types of gendered constructs influence the success of the securitization process, drawing on empirical material from Russian social networks during the first war in Ukraine in 2014 to 2016. This article argues against gender's silencing role, but instead its central role in influencing every stage of the securitization process. Moreover, the author shows how feminization rhetoric paved the way to the legitimization of the current war.
All right, so the way I was looking at it, I was trying to see why a lot of social media users were so obsessed with gender. And I saw that gender actually came out in a lot of different ways. And the three main avenues that they used gendered rhetoric in the way they were discussing Ukraine was, well, there's the first division is obviously threat or non-threat. So as we all know, femininity can often be considered a threat. So if it's a woman that is too politically active or she's a politician, in the American context, some people might remember castrating first ladies, tropes that were used by the Republican Party in the 90s during the election campaign of Bill Clinton. So, this kind of threatening femininity when women have too much political power. This was also a very common narrative during the suffragette protests back in the beginning of the 20th century, when you had a lot of caricatures of supposedly very ugly women who just wanted to have political power because there was nothing else for them in this life.
Mhm.
And this is actually, this kind of narrative hasn't really changed that much over the years, and it still remains quite prominent among politicians across the board, so to say. And another issue here is obviously it's not just the threatening femininity, but it's also the adequate amount of masculinity as well. So it's also important to be the real man. What does a real man supposed to look like, for example, how he's supposed to behave? And this amount of maleness is critical for a lot of people. Again, and not just in Russia specifically, but also in the US. You might have also noticed all of these jokes about Donald Trump having small hands or big hands. Like this is pretty much this obsession with the amount of masculinity a man or especially a political leader is supposed to have. So of course, social media users, knowing them, are also obsessed with this kind of with those kind of ideas. So obviously, start to compare who looks more manly, who is more the man in the situation. Does the man ride the horse bare chested or does he not? So this is the kind of obsession with the maleness and like the adequate amount of maleness is something that not just the political leaders have in many authoritarian societies, but also a lot of people who want to be adjacent or want to be included in that perception of maleness, because in a lot of cultures, being male is obviously more preferable. It means that you are in control, you're dominating the situation. So obviously, you want to be adjacent to that maleness. So that's why you want to belong to, let's say, a country that has a big nuclear button, or you want to be part of a country that behaves in a certain way, for example, which is, again, a trait that is associated stereotypically with a male actor.
Mhm.
And of course, then if we talk about this kind of binary, you either can be an assertive, rational man or this emotional femininity. You also have something in between, and this is again, this makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. So if you have, let's say, a woman that is acting too politically active, then this is not a proper amount of femininity that this woman has. And then you have also men who, let's say, are effeminate or they do not behave as some cultures mandate men to behave. And that's why that also makes it somewhat dangerous for the political culture. And again, we can see that a lot in the conservative party in the US, where they're talking about, like, if you don't eat meat, then you are not a real American. You cannot represent Americans because real men would supposed to be, meat eater. And if you're a vegetarian, that like you are not a real man. So this kind of different markers of masculinity, if you don't tick all of the boxes, then this becomes sort of a danger to the society, because if this gender pyramid sort of falls apart, then what is left of society? Nothing. So this is even framed often as an existential threat to society. And that's why, again, a lot of this moral panic about trans people, for example, this is why it works so well, because they're trying to play on this foundational what they see or what they're trying to frame as foundational markers and structures of society.
How all encompassing do you think the gendered rhetoric is? Because in the article, you write that describing objects, or really in this case, countries, people, whatever your adversary is, I suppose, or just anything. Describing these objects as female or as a child are both examples of feminization. And you cite the "Save the Donbass Children" meme. And later in the article, you write that feminization often equals devaluation, but that it can also equal homosexuality. And so, like, how broad is what isn't feminization? How big is this concept? Is like this the base of all political rhetoric, or and how big are these ideas, I guess?
Well, I think that what I was trying to show in the article is that ultimately we're trying to create not we, of course, the authoritarian leaders. I'm not trying to create that. I'm trying to point it out that the authoritarian leaders are trying to create a hierarchy. And the way you build that hierarchy and you maintain it, obviously, is also you need to put something that is more valuable on the top and then something that is submissive on the bottom, right? So in this hierarchy, it's, well, two things are usually very helpful to create that hierarchy: use racism or use gender. So the more convenient thing is, of course, gender, because most people are familiar with the concept somehow, and they are trying to see what is actually more valuable or less valuable. And especially when we talk about very stressful crisis situations like wars, we always, a lot of people in this kind of very stressful situation resort to binary thinking. And then you need to think, okay, fight or flight, for example, right? And then you have, of course, you need to fight for something, but then you also need to protect somebody. And that's why in wars, we often see the posters where you have women or children that are supposed to be saved. So the so-called damsel in distress trope. You're supposed to save somebody, so you need to step up and be the man to be saving these people, women and children specifically. And another issue here is, of course, racism. So when we go back to the discourse of colonialism on the 19th century, for instance, we see a lot of the discourse is actually framed in very family terms. So we see a lot of colonizers talking about how we need to civilize somebody. We have a mission to civilize those, stupid, underdeveloped people, so to say. And then they also talk
The
about
garden and the jungle.
Oh my God! Don't get me started on that one. I just use that example with my students about the garden and the jungle issue. So this is racist, of course, because there's a very rich tradition of discussing. Again, we're talking about binaries. Somebody is civilized, somebody is not civilized. A lot of that rhetoric, especially if you take a look at the British colonial rhetoric, French colonial rhetoric, they all talk about how they're the father trying to sort of educate the children, that are not evolved yet, or they need to educate them to bring them to the same level of civilization that they are. Those family metaphors are all over the place. And that's why this kind of civilizing mission is really replete with all those comparisons of even sometimes those are, oh, let's liberate the women, or let's rescue the women of the Middle East, the poor veiled women of Middle East. So again, like this family or gendered dynamics are all over in this in the colonial discourse as well. So that's why it's trying to make somebody seem as less capable, as not having agency,
Right.
and not able to actually control their own life, that needs some guidance from somebody else.
So it's not that gendered rhetoric is like the only binary out there. It's just one of the more evocative and common among authoritarians. And maybe everybody, I guess. Anybody
Yes.
trying to enforce hierarchy.
Yeah.
Okay.
But racism is also very important, of course. Like, in
Right.
order to enforce some kind of hierarchy, you need to kind of press all the buttons, and racism is obviously another very effective tactic to use.
Yeah. Did you also notice that in your study of the anti-Maidan contactor group? And we'll get into the methodology a little bit later, but were you looking specifically for gendered rhetoric, or were you looking to see what's the hierarchical language being used, and I'll focus on the one that's most dominant, or did you go in looking for gendered stuff?
At first, I actually was looking to references to the Great Patriotic War, because that was actually the focus of my study initially. And I was actually trying to see how the memory of the Great Patriotic War is being instrumentalized by anti-Maidan users in order to justify the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So this is actually originally what I was looking at. But then I noticed that a lot of this framing that used the Great Patriotic War also was trying to use other types of narratives that often included this gendered component. And of course, anti-Maidan is a very racist group, and so they had a lot of very dehumanizing rhetoric. So you're probably familiar with the way some animal comparisons that were very common and everything else. This is, in some ways, we can also see that as an attempt to create a hierarchy. If we are people and those people are animals, means that we are superior to them,
right,
in many ways. So this is something that was, for instance, used during the Obama presidency.
So this stuff is used we're talking about how this binary thinking is used to justify basically aggression or authoritarianism.
Yep.
When you're responding to authoritarianism or fighting against it, Is there also binary thinking? Does that exist in any existential crisis, or do you not need linguistic tropes there? It's just self-evident that if you're being attacked, then it's automatically existential. You don't have to rely on rhetorical tricks, or is that not the case? Do we see these binaries among the victims essentially? Whether in this case, I guess it's Ukraine or in American talking points or something like that.
I think that on the other side, we usually see the attempt to push back against those binaries and show that's actually not the world is not black and white. It's not as simple.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that, again, this dynamic that I'm describing is related to securitization, which means that you're trying to present something as a matter of security. Something is supposed to be an existential threat. And this in this kind of
does that imply does that assume that whatever the issue is not actually existential, that they're making it up essentially, or
Yes.
is this
Yeah.
it's all like that's the assumption, is it's not actually existential?
Yeah. So this is
So are you making a normative assessment there? You're kind of stepping above the people that are having the conversation and saying, well, actually they're playing games here. It's not really what they say.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to show is that they're trying to press certain buttons to make the audience believe certain things. For example, we know that talking about Great Patriotic War in the Russian context is a very effective rhetorical mechanism
Mm-hmm.
because that would resonate with the majority of the population in Russia. So that is a very effective mechanism to use in order to persuade somebody. And this is what I'm trying to expose, this kind of dynamics. If you're trying to represent something as a matter of security, especially as a matter of an existential threat, that is supposed to make your audience of this pronouncement much more susceptible to fear. So they're supposed to get into this fight or flight mode. And then they will not reflect too much about what is the person's trying to do with you. So you're going into this fight or flight mode, and then you're not necessarily reflecting on what kind of buttons are being pushed, so to say. So I'm trying to break down this rhetoric and show how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And by showing how it works, you're also kind of deconstructing the whole narrative and showing that maybe this is not an existential threat. I'm not actually saying, I'm not necessarily passing judgment on it, but I'm just showing how narratively it works if you represent something as an existential threat.
And do you think that in the case of Ukraine, I mean, I know that you're looking at this Kontakte group, anti-Maidan.
Yep.
Now, maybe this is beyond the scope of the essay, but just generally, I'm wondering how you feel. Do you think that the bellicosity, I don't know what the word is there, bellicose, well, just the whole vibe of wanting to have this war, do you think that's driven by the political elite, or is it a grassroots thing? I mean, it seems pretty clear that it's not. Most Russians did not wake up one day and decide they wanted to invade, but obviously there are, there's this like war party among the elites, but then there's also, these, I mean, and a lot of them are probably on the anti-Maidan community, these kind of like, these ideologues essentially, whether they're Duganites or just sort of random internet edgelords or whatever. Who do you think is advocating or leading the way on this? Like, who's promoting it the most? Where does it start? Chicken or the egg?
It's hard to say. And the thing is that obviously there is quite a bit of culture. Like we do have a lot of this heritage of the sort of, I would say, an ethnic hierarchy that was built in Soviet Union as well. So you have this, let's say, some people had their own republic, some had like an oblast, or some had krai, or some had an autonomous region or something like that. So there was also a sort of implicit ethnic hierarchy in Soviet Union that we're still sort of living through today, the remnants of that. And even though the official narrative was obviously the friendship of the peoples and everybody's brother to each other and everything like that, again, brother, not sister, so the gender also plays in here as well. But the remnants of that imperial thinking also is still kind of runs in the society in many ways. So in a way, it was easy for the government to whip up some of that imperial sentiment in certain groups. And we do see there's definitely a war party in the Russian society. There are people who support the war. In anti-Maidan over the years, I've seen people advocating genocide for years. So this is not something that came out of nowhere.
And this is like obviously a conversation now, especially regarding like the war correspondents and the bloggers on Telegram and how they're ready for like a wider war than the Kremlin seems to be. And there's a lot of conversation about, or you just sort of see analysis and op-eds and tweets and whatnot of people saying, oh, well, sometimes it's described as kind of Putin has let the genie out of the bottle or something, and he has to now he has to deal with these. They're not always loyalist, I guess is the idea. Like they're driven by this, whether it's an ideology of like rebuilding Russia in a certain image or just conquering Ukraine, but that now like this is like an independent force almost, civic force that he has to deal with that's different from the opposition. And I'm wondering, did you get that sense when looking at anti-Maidan of like, oh, these people are kind of a force unto themselves? Or I think you mentioned earlier in this interview that a lot of people are eager to be adjacent to or belong to the conversation that's initiated by the authorities. Like, did you see them more as sort of chasing Putin's tail, being like, oh, we want to be part of your cool idea here? Or is it like, Putin, get off your ass and, do the invasion. We're ready for it.
I've seen all sorts of things over the years, I have to say, because I've been monitoring this group since 2013. 14. So I've
for
seen
your sins, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen all sorts of rhetoric, types of rhetoric there over the years. And the thing is that, especially in 2014, there was way more division over what Russia is supposed to be. So there was obviously white supremacists there as well, who were totally excited about shedding some of the ethnic republics, let's say, and then just having the pure Slavs joining the group, or stop feeding Caucasus was an issue at some point as well. So this kind of white supremacist current was definitely very prominent in 2014. But as you probably know, this was also the time, 2014. 2015 was the time when the Russian government specifically targeted neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, because they were kind of going way beyond the Kremlin policies. So they were like pro-Kremlin, but too much. So they were going way much further at that time. But frankly, what we can also see in anti-Maidan is that they're kind of on that level in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that they're, again, like anti-Maidan is also not this one monolithic group. So they also have different ways of voicing their support for the regime, and they sometimes they're unhappy that the government is not going far enough. And so there are also people who were uncomfortable with genocide, and there are people who are in the same group. So I guess that the main difference that they had there in anti-Maidan is that they were trying to justify it in certain ways, and I could also see some evidence of involvement of bots in the group as well. And especially given the very uniform messaging after the 24th of February 2022, I could also see that there was some evidence of sort of trying to bring the messaging in line with what the Kremlin was saying at the time. So, for example, on the 24th of February, they posted this big Z manifesto about like, we never started the wars, but we will finish them, and like we're not giving своих не бросаем, we're not giving up on ours. So this kind of stuff was very much in line with the official rhetoric at the beginning of the war.
How representative do you think that this contacted group is? Like, how did you decide to study this single group? How generalizable do you think your findings are here?
Well,
to the rest of, I guess, well, let's say to the rest of internet culture, and then also I'd be interested to know how much you think internet culture is reflective of like something in the real world.
That's always like the main question that researchers of digital humanities ask, like, oh, can you? What's the actual difference between online and offline? And always we usually say, we don't necessarily know. And my focus actually at the beginning was I was just wondering how the pro-Kremlin side justifies themselves. So we saw a lot of research, especially like, I think there was a bit of a bias in terms of Russia scholarship in general. Most people were interested in the oppositional narratives. And I was like, yeah, it's super interesting, of course, but I also want to see what the pro-Kremlin side wants to say. And now it's, of course, very relevant how they justify themselves. So at the time, I would say that in 2014, especially after the annexation of Crimea, the anti-Maidan was way more representative of the general mood in the society than it is now. Because right now, they have moved way beyond the sort of the benchmark of the greatness thing, because
now they're like, let's do genocide.
Yeah, exactly. So in 2014, they were less focused on that. And in 2014, they were more about, oh yeah, Crimea is ours, Russia is great again, and obviously in more obscene terms, but that's pretty much was the gist. And now a lot of them are straight up advocating genocide. And the thing is that the reason I focused on that group was just to not only to try and understand how that is possible and how they're trying to justify all of that, but also at that point it was more of a mainstream position, actually, because as we know, we don't know how, obviously, how accurate public opinion polls were in 2014, but I would probably agree that the majority of Russian society at that point in time supported the annexation of Crimea. So at that point in time, it was not a controversial point as much. I think right now the ambivalence is much greater, and that's why I can also see there's actually less activity in the anti-Maidan group. So obviously the activity also fluctuated a lot. In 2014, 2015, they were very active. Then the activity died down, maybe related to the Minsk agreements. And then obviously now they picked up the activity again.
Right.
I could also see the fluctuation in membership over the years. So again, the maximum of their membership was around 2015. They had 550,000 people, and then it dipped down to about 430, and then it climbed back again to about 500,000. But I wouldn't make any claims about how representative that group is. I'm just trying to understand how one specific segment sort of justifies themselves.
Mhm.
That was my main focus.
Okay. Now, if you take away either the promotion of by the state authorities, let's say, or just the broad appeal among internet users and potentially the general public of these anti-gay, anti-feminist, feminizing tropes and narratives, do you think the Kremlin would still be able to sustain public support or even, passive support, let's say, for the invasion of Ukraine, or does the whole thing collapse without this kind of gendered rhetoric? Like, does it rely on that, or do you think that there's another hierarchical form of rhetoric that's just waiting there to step in, or do they need, without this gendered stuff, they can't do it?
I think the gender stuff definitely reinforces the imperial mindset that Putin is trying to tap into, because this kind of hierarchy also existed in the Soviet Union. You had like, so the mother Russia, then you had the small Russia or the white Russia. They're obviously supposed to be subordinate to the big Russia, right? And gender hierarchy is actually supposed to maintain that and help maintain that hierarchical position. So if you pull out the gendered hierarchy, the whole hierarchy becomes much more wobbly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this conservative turn that happened in 2012, around the time we had the Pussy Riot trial, you had the Dima Yakovlev law, you had the ban on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations. So all of that stuff actually was building or kind of trying to resurrect, I would even say, some of the Stalinist understanding of the gender order, because Stalin was actually the one that introduced the criminal punishment for sodomy. So you're sort of trying to latch on to this vague memory of homosexuality being a criminal offense is something that was probably quite effective. And again, if we take a look at the public opinion polls at the time around the Pussy Riot case, for example, a lot of people were on board with the fact that they got a 2-year prison sentence. And I'm not sure that there was such a massive public support for the propaganda of the ban on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations. But at the time, the way it was phrased, it was again the same damsel in distress trope, because it was a ban on propaganda among minors, so helpless children who are supposed to be protected from evil Western propaganda. So this is again the same trick that is used to try and protect somebody. This kind of threat, existential threat to the future of the nation. The small little helpless children. So this was exactly the same trick that was used now.
Is this strictly a tool, or is it a sort of self-sustaining ideology? Like, would the Kremlin? Do you think the Kremlin or the Russian political elite, the authorities, would they even think of Ukraine the same way as something either to fear or that needs to be dominated without this gendered rhetoric, without these tropes that we've been discussing? Like, is that leading them to even perceive things this way, or do they have their own reasons for doing it, self-interest and so on, and then they just use this rhetoric to achieve their ends?
I cannot get into the heads of Russian political elite,
What
but
do you
I can
think? What do you think, though?
hypothesize. I can
We're all in our big
hypothesize.
armchairs.
Yes, I know. So what I'm trying, especially if you take a look at a lot of Putin's rhetoric and a lot of his associates, I guess, you see a
Hmm.
lot of the references to prison language. That prison language is extremely hierarchical and extremely gendered. So obviously, this kind of idea of the hierarchy in prison is vital. It's existential. So if you're on top of that hierarchy, it means that you survive prison. And this very conscious references to prison lingo and prison vocabulary makes me think that they actually think in those categories. They actually see the world in this very hierarchical, gendered pyramid where real men are supposed to be on top, and then those are not on top would be dominated or would have to submit to those that are on top. So this kind of references to prison language is, for me, very indicative of the fact that they actually do think of the world in those categories.
You've been listening to The Naked Pravda. On today's show, you heard from Dr. Lisa Goffman, an assistant professor of Russian discourse and politics at the University of Groningen, about how gendered rhetoric influences Russia's securitization process and the ways people use it to justify the invasion of Ukraine. Thanks for tuning in. On future episodes of the show, we'll be discussing the impact of sanctions on Russian commercial aviation, the future of Chechnya's dictatorship, and more. See you next week.